The morning light in the Hollywood Hills came soft and reluctant, washing over the manicured lawns and winding roads like a hesitant confession. At 8 a.m., the silence in the house on North Mariposa Drive was broken not by laughter or the echoes of a party, but by the muffled gasp of a maid. She had stepped into the tiled bathroom and found her employer, Carole Landis, stretched out on the cold floor. Her silk nightgown clung to her skin, damp with sweat. Nearby, the white enamel of the sink glinted, and on the counter sat the emptied bottles of Seconal, a barbiturate that promised sleep but had often delivered death. The bathroom smelled faintly of perfume, a ghost of glamour clinging stubbornly to the air, but beneath it lingered the acrid bite of pills. A clock in the next room ticked mercilessly, indifferent to the scene unfolding within these walls. Carole's lips, still painted in a faint shade of rose, were parted as if she had tried one last time to call out, or perhaps to whisper a name. On the table beside her bed, they found letters, several of them, handwritten in the restless scrawl of a woman fighting exhaustion, to her mother, to friends, and most hauntingly, to Rex Harrison, the married British actor who had been the center of her affections in the final months. The ink blurred where tears had fallen, or perhaps where hands had trembled. In them she expressed despair, longing, and a sense of unbearable finality. Yet between the lines, something else flickered. An accusation, a plea, a silence she dared not name outright. By the time the authorities arrived, the room was already filling with whispers. Was it a cry for help that went unanswered, or a deliberate escape from a life too heavy with disappointment? The official line would be simple: suicide by overdose. But the details refused to stay quiet. Why did her last calls go unanswered? Why did Rex Harrison, who had dined with her the night before, leave her home so quickly, so quietly? And why did the studio system move with such efficiency to contain the story, smoothing jagged questions into a palatable tragedy? The house itself seemed to carry the weight of contradiction. Photographs of Carole in her prime smiled from the mantel, luminous, radiant, adored by millions. But here, in the same walls, lay the final scene of a woman undone. The mirror above her vanity reflected only emptiness, but it was said that in those last hours, she had stared into it for a long time, brushing her hair in slow, deliberate strokes, as though preparing for an audience no one else could see. Outside, Los Angeles stirred into life, oblivious. The city was already warm, the air humming with ambition and traffic. But within the walls of the house, time had stalled. The silence became suffocating, heavy with what-ifs. In that silence, Carole Landis ceased to be just a starlet with a bright smile. She became a riddle, one that Hollywood would prefer to forget, but which has never truly faded. There is something profoundly human in the way she was found, not in the glamour of her image, but in the vulnerability of her end. Fame had promised her immortality, but here, she was only mortal, fragile, undone by forces that glitter and darkness alike could not disguise. Like so many in her era, her story ended not with applause, but with a clock ticking in an empty house, and with letters that felt like fragments of a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. And so, the image lingers. Carole Landis, 29 years old, lying on the bathroom floor as morning light filters in. A final scene without a curtain call, but with an echo. An echo that asks not only how she died, but who might have allowed her to die. The clock ticks still. Long before the headlines reduced her to a scandal, Carole Landis was a girl named Frances Lillian Mary Ridsta. She was born in 1919, a small town in Wisconsin, far from the glittering streets of Los Angeles. The winters there were brutal, the kind that pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest. And her childhood was one of modest means and quiet struggle. Yet even as a child, Frances carried a light in her that seemed to strain against the walls of her world. Neighbors remembered her as restless, imaginative, and too pretty to stay here forever. Her beauty arrived early, and with it came a kind of fragile power. Men looked at her differently. Women remarked on her posture, her hair, her skin. But it was not enough for Frances to be admired. She wanted to be remembered. She dreamed of Hollywood the way some dream of salvation, convinced it was not just a place, but a destiny waiting for her. The cinema posters she saw in local theaters were more than advertisements. They were promises. By the time she was a teenager, Frances had grown into a striking young woman with an hourglass figure and an unshakable determination. She left school at 15, took on menial jobs to survive, and then, like so many dreamers of her generation, headed west with little more than courage and conviction. The road to Hollywood was littered with broken illusions, but for Frances, the risk was intoxicating. In 1937, she arrived in California and reinvented herself with a new name, Carole Landis. Carole, she later explained, was in honor of Carole Lombard, her idol. Landis was plucked from the ether, chosen because it felt sharp, clean, and memorable. The transformation was complete. Frances, the small-town girl, was gone. Carole Landis, the future star, had stepped into the frame. At first, Hollywood gave her only crumbs. She worked as an extra, dancing in the background, playing the nameless pretty girl who never spoke a line. But her persistence and her beauty did not go unnoticed. Studio executives began to see in her the outline of something more, the kind of star who could be molded into an icon. In 1939, after countless auditions and rejections, she finally won a contract. It was in those early years that she earned the nickname, the Ice Cream Blonde. The phrase, meant to capture her creamy complexion and platinum hair, was both flattering and dismissive. She was glamorous, yes, but also trivialized, a woman reduced to sweetness and surface, her talent often overlooked. Yet Carole fought to be more than an ornament. She studied acting, pushed for better roles, and tried to shape her career with seriousness. Her breakout came with 1 Million BC in 1940, where she played a cave girl draped in fur. The role was hardly sophisticated, but her screen presence was undeniable. Audiences adored her. Critics took note, and suddenly, the name Carole Landis was everywhere. She was invited to glamorous parties, photographed in magazines, and courted by men who promised both love and opportunity. But even in success, there was a shadow. The studio promoted her image relentlessly, crafting a persona of vitality and seduction. Beneath the surface, Carole was restless, often insecure, and never convinced she truly belonged. Fame, she once confided to a friend, felt like standing in front of a mirror that only showed what others wanted to see. And yet, in those years, she dazzled. Soldiers during World War II pinned her photographs in their lockers and painted her likeness on planes. She was not merely a starlet, she became a symbol of hope for men thousands of miles from home. Her visits to military bases and hospitals earned her the affectionate nickname, the Soldier's Girl. For them, she was light in a time of shadow. Still, light can cast deep shadows. For Carole, every triumph seemed to carry with it the seeds of disappointment. Hollywood could lift you up in the morning and forget you by nightfall. Her ascent was real, but so was the instability beneath it, a fault line waiting for the right pressure to break. And so, in the flicker of projectors and the flashes of cameras, Carole Landis was born anew. Glamorous, adored, yet already entangled in a city that promised immortality, but offered little safety. The clock began to tick, not just toward fame, but toward the tragedy that fame so often conceals. Hollywood, in the 1942nd, was a theater of illusions. And Carole Landis, radiant and eager, became both its beneficiary and its captive. Behind the photographs and premieres, her private life unfolded in a blur of romantic entanglements. Her beauty and vivacity drew powerful men toward her like moths to flame. Yet the flames often left her scorched. By her mid-20s, Carole had already accumulated marriages and affairs that read more like a dossier than a love story. She married 4 times, though none lasted. The first was a teenage union, impulsive and brief, dissolving almost as quickly as it began. Others followed. A marriage to an army pilot, another to a screenwriter, each collapsing under the weight of passion soured by neglect or betrayal. She longed for stability, yet seemed to chase it in the arms of men least likely to provide it. Beyond marriages, there were affairs whispered about in studio corridors. Executives, fellow actors, men of means and influence. Some adored her genuinely. Others used her, leaving scars she carried quietly. She was adored, yes, but seldom truly seen. The paradox haunted her. The more the world desired her image, the lonelier she became in her private hours. The most perilous entanglement of all would come in the 1942nd, when she met Rex Harrison, the dashing British actor whose career was soaring. Their affair burned brightly but dangerously, for Harrison was married to actress Lily Palmer and deeply embedded in Hollywood society. To Carole, he was intoxicating, charming, witty, and worldly. To others, he was opportunistic, a man who took what was offered and never risked what was his. Carole fell hard. Friends later recalled how she spoke of him with a mixture of reverence and desperation. She dreamed of marriage, of legitimacy, of escaping the carousel of fleeting affairs that had defined her 20s. But Harrison, bound by his own ambition and marriage, offered little more than half promises. Their relationship was passionate, volatile, and fraught with the kind of secrecy that erodes the spirit. This was not the only dangerous liaison. Carole's social circle often placed her at the crossroads of Hollywood power and politics. She attended gatherings where moguls brokered careers and destroyed reputations over glasses of champagne. She dined with men whose lives were paved with scandal. Some admired her for her warmth, her quick wit, her unpretentious charm. Others saw in her a vulnerability to be exploited. It was during these years that Carole began to confide in friends about her growing fatigue. The nights of glamour and attention no longer sustained her. Instead, they seemed to drain her. She wrote in her diary of feeling like a performer, even off stage, as though her very existence required constant rehearsal. In mirrors, she sometimes searched not for beauty but for authenticity, whispering to herself that she was more than the smile they photographed. Hollywood, however, had little patience for introspection. It demanded perfection, and Carole gave it on red carpets, in magazines, during tours for soldiers overseas. She embodied the fantasy so completely that it was difficult for the public to imagine her as anything other than luminous. Yet beneath the shimmer, cracks widened. Failed marriages piled upon each other. Affairs ended in disillusionment. And Carole's faith in love as a sanctuary, as salvation slipped further away, the tension between her public image and private despair grew unbearable. Friends recalled that she often said, "I can't keep pretending forever." It was both a lament and a warning, a recognition that the persona she had crafted might one day collapse under the weight of reality. By the late 1942nd, as her affair with Rex Harrison deepened and her career slowed, Carole found herself suspended in a fragile balance. A star still adored, but a woman increasingly undone by longing. In her world, love and destruction had become indistinguishable, and somewhere in that blurred line, her fate began to take shape. The pendulum of her life swung wildly between glittering premieres and tear-stained letters, between laughter at Hollywood banquets and silence in her empty home. Always the clock ticked, a metronome of inevitability. For Carole Landis, the pursuit of love had become not just a passion, but a peril, guiding her step by step toward the dark edge of her story. The house was quiet when the letters were discovered, dozens of pages scattered across tables and dressers, fragments of a life written in ink. Carole Landis, who had been photographed in satin gowns and radiant smiles, had poured her anguish into words that felt heavy with finality. These notes would become her last testimony, a paper trail leading into the shadows of her mind. One was addressed to her mother, Clara, the woman who had raised her in modest Wisconsin and who had watched her daughter's transformation into Hollywood's ice cream blonde. The words were tender yet resigned, laced with apology. Carole wrote of love and gratitude, but also of exhaustion. An exhaustion that suggested her beauty and success had become burdens too heavy to bear. Another letter was written to friends, each line a plea for understanding. She apologized for her failures, confessed her despair, and hinted at betrayals she could no longer endure. These notes painted a portrait not of glamour but of fragility. They revealed a woman who had spent her youth giving herself to others, audiences, lovers, studios, and who now seemed emptied, her reserves of hope drained. Most haunting of all was the letter to Rex Harrison. The ink was darker, as if pressed harder into the page, and the tone carried the ache of a heart pushed beyond breaking. She confessed her love, begged for honesty, and implied an ultimatum: either she could no longer live in this endless cycle of secrecy and rejection, or she would not live at all. It was a letter written in the quiet hours before dawn, when resolve hardens and despair crystallizes. The letters left investigators with a sense of narrative, a kind of script for her death. A woman abandoned, overwhelmed, and resolved to end her suffering. Yet even as they served as evidence of suicide, they opened darker questions. Why had she written so many? Why had she taken such care to address each relationship, each wound? Was this truly the work of a woman intent on dying, or of someone desperate to be heard before it was too late? Her handwriting itself told a story. In certain places, the script wavered, uneven, as though her hand trembled. In others, it was steady, almost forceful, suggesting determination. Psychologists who later examined the letters saw in them the duality of someone torn between a desire for release and an unresolved attachment to life. To some, they felt less like farewells and more like messages left in expectation of a response that never came. It is impossible to ignore the eerie symbolism of these letters. They were mirrors of her life, carefully presented, deeply emotional, yet ultimately misinterpreted. Carole, who had so often been reduced to a persona, tried one last time to reveal her inner world in her own voice. And like her performances, they drew attention, but perhaps not the kind she needed most. In Hollywood, letters like these were not just personal artifacts. They were liabilities. The studios had long perfected the art of managing scandal, of shaping narratives into palatable stories for public consumption. A stack of letters dripping with emotion and accusation threatened to tarnish reputations, especially those of powerful men. It is said that some were quietly removed, withheld from the public eye, leaving only fragments for the official record. What remains is enough to haunt. Her words echo like footsteps down a long, empty hallway, each letter a reminder that Carole Landis was not merely a starlet, not merely an image, but a woman desperate to be understood. In her final act, she had written herself into history, though not in the way she might have hoped. And so the letters remain, fragile and accusing, like pressed flowers found in an old diary. They whisper of love betrayed, of promises broken, of a life suspended between the spotlight and the shadows. For Carole Landis, her last words were not spoken into the air, but inscribed onto paper, preserved forever in ink, the only part of her story that could not be smoothed away by Hollywood's careful hands. On the evening of the 4th of July, 1948, the city of Los Angeles buzzed with the sound of fireworks, the sky erupting in bursts of light and color. For most, it was a night of celebration, of laughter and champagne. But in the quiet dining room of Carole Landis's home, a different drama was unfolding, one that would become the center of speculation for decades to come. She had invited Rex Harrison for dinner. The table was set carefully, with the precision of someone trying to impress or perhaps to cling to the semblance of intimacy. Candles flickered against polished glassware, and Carole had prepared the meal herself. Friends would later say she was determined to make the evening special, as if this dinner might change everything between them. Harrison arrived, his presence filling the room with his usual charm, his English accent carrying a kind of detached warmth. To outsiders, he seemed calm, gracious, even affectionate. But to Carole, the evening carried a sharper edge. Beneath the conversation and the clinking of glasses, tension simmered. She wanted answers, commitments he was unwilling or unable to give. The two had been entangled for months, their affair an open secret in certain circles. Carole loved him with a desperate devotion. But Harrison remained firmly bound to his wife, the actress Lily Palmer. He had promised little and delivered less. To Carole, the uncertainty gnawed like a wound. She had built her hopes around him, and those hopes now teetered on collapse. What passed between them that night has never been fully revealed. Some accounts suggest the dinner ended in heated words, Carole pressing for promises Harrison would not make. Others describe a quieter, more sorrowful scene, with Carole resigned to rejection, and Harrison offering little more than vague sympathy. What is known is that by the end of the evening, Harrison left, slipping back into the shadows of his own life, leaving Carole alone with the echoes of their final conversation. Hours later, Carole would be found dead. The timing has haunted the story ever since. Had she staged the dinner as a last attempt to secure a future with him? Was her despair sharpened by his refusal to leave his wife? Or did something darker occur, words spoken in cruelty, actions that pushed her beyond the edge? Harrison himself insisted he had left her alive and well, and no evidence ever emerged to contradict him. Yet the proximity of his departure to her death leaves a shadow that has never lifted. The symbolism of that dinner is impossible to ignore. The candles that once flickered with the promise of romance became funereal markers, the final supper of a woman whose life was slipping away. The table, laid with care, became a stage for heartbreak rather than love. Even the fireworks outside seemed cruelly ironic, exploding above the city as Carole's spirit dimmed within her own home. For Carole, the dinner may have been a last plea, a final attempt to anchor herself to someone she adored. For Harrison, it was perhaps just another evening, another obligation fulfilled before returning to his comfortable life. The asymmetry between their experiences is chilling. For her, it was everything. For him, it was little more than a pause in his schedule. The next morning, Harrison was among the first to arrive at her home after the discovery of her body. His role in the aftermath calm, composed, offering condolences only deepened the suspicions. Some believed he had known more than he admitted, others that he had been the catalyst for her despair. But Hollywood was quick to shield him, ensuring that his reputation remained largely unscathed. Carole's tragedy became hers alone to bear. In the end, that dinner stands as one of the most haunting contradictions of her story. An evening that should have been filled with warmth, but instead became the threshold of silence. The candles burned out, the table was cleared, and the woman who had once been adored by millions was left in darkness, staring at a future that never arrived. Hollywood knew how to bury a scandal before the ground was even broken. When Carole Landis was found dead, the machinery of the studio system whirred into motion with the same efficiency it used to promote a film. Death, like box office failure, was something to be managed, not mourned. Within hours, MGM and Fox publicists were drafting statements, shaping her death into a narrative that could be consumed without discomfort. The official line was clear. Carole Landis, beautiful but fragile, had succumbed to despair and ended her own life. It was tragic, yes, but not complicated. The press releases emphasized her sensitivity, her loneliness, her troubled romances. They smoothed her jagged humanity into something poetic, even convenient. What they did not emphasize were the contradictions. They did not dwell on Rex Harrison's presence the night before. nor on the letters that bore tones of accusation as much as farewell. They did not mention the whispers among her friends that she had still been making plans, that she had appointments scheduled, that her career, while waning, was not yet extinguished. Such details were inconvenient, and Hollywood hated inconvenience. Instead, the studios leaned into a familiar script, a tragic starlet, undone by her own heart. The public had seen it before, and they would see it again. It was a narrative that allowed fans to mourn without asking questions, that preserved the reputations of powerful men, and that allowed the film industry to continue its unbroken march. Behind closed doors, however, the silence was more unsettling. Friends who visited her home after her death recalled a strange sense of order, as if things had been tidied, rearranged, adjusted before the police ever arrived. Some letters were shown, others rumored to have disappeared. What was withheld, and by whom, remains a matter of speculation. Carole's funeral was swift and dignified, attended by Hollywood stars who offered polished grief beneath dark veils. Photographers captured the solemn procession, the flowers, the bowed heads. To the public, it was a closing act, a respectful farewell. But for those who knew her best, the air was thick with unease. There were too many silences, too many half-truths. The press coverage followed the studio line. Headlines spoke of unhappy love affairs and personal struggles, rarely probing deeper. The more salacious tabloids hinted at betrayal, but even they avoided naming names too loudly. No paper wanted to draw the ire of studios that controlled both stars and stories. The machine was bigger than Carole Landis, and her death, however tragic, would not be allowed to stain it. This silence was not unique to Carole. In those years, Hollywood perfected the art of the beautiful tragedy. Jean Harlow, Thelma Todd, Peg Entwistle. Each was wrapped in a shroud of myth, their deaths stripped of messy details and turned into cautionary tales or romantic legends. Carole simply joined their ranks, her story polished until the edges no longer cut. But the truth has a way of clinging, even when unspoken. In private circles, whispers persisted, of arguments overheard, of men who knew more than they admitted, of letters burned before they could be read. For every polished obituary, there was a rumor carried quietly through studio corridors, a sense that her death was not the simple tragedy it appeared to be. Perhaps the cruelest silence was not the one imposed by the studios, but the one Carole herself endured in life. She had shouted her pain in letters, in conversations, in the very fabric of her relationships, and still, no one had truly listened. In death, her voice was further subdued, reshaped into something more palatable, more cinematic, and so the city moved on. New premieres lit up marquees, new stars graced magazine covers. The clock ticked forward, and Carole Landis became another ghost in Hollywood's attic, remembered vaguely, mourned briefly, and buried beneath the gloss of a narrative that fit neatly into the industry's preferred script. But beneath that silence, a question lingered, stubborn and unresolved. If the story was so simple, why did it feel so incomplete? The coroner's report on Carole Landis's death arrived quickly, almost too quickly, and offered little in the way of revelation. The verdict was clear: suicide by barbiturate overdose. The conclusion seemed neat, final, an explanation designed to silence questions. But in the shadows of Los Angeles, where silence often concealed more than it revealed, the autopsy's brevity stirred more suspicion than clarity. Seconal, the barbiturate found in her system, was indeed lethal in sufficient doses. The empty bottles beside her body were enough to support the conclusion. Yet the details surrounding the case were curiously unexamined. Why had no one explored whether she had taken the pills gradually or in one determined swallow? Why was there little analysis of timing when exactly she ingested the drugs, and how long she lay suffering before death finally claimed her? Forensic science in the late 1942 was less exacting than it is today. but the haste with which her case was closed felt deliberate. There were no toxicology details released to the public, beyond the most basic observations. No mention of possible alcohol in her system. No deeper inquiry into whether she might have been coerced, tricked, or simply left unattended while in distress. The autopsy was a whisper, where a scream might have been expected. More troubling still was the absence of bruising or external trauma noted in the report. For some, this confirmed the suicide narrative. For others, it raised the specter of manipulation. Had she been unconscious before the pills were consumed? Had evidence been overlooked or quietly omitted? The possibility lingered, too fragile to prove yet too haunting to dismiss. Rex Harrison's name never appeared in the coroner's summary, though by then, whispers of his involvement were circulating. Officially, he was merely a friend who had dined with her hours before her death. Yet the omission of his significance, his affair with Carole, his presence in her final hours felt conspicuous. It was as though the report itself was designed to fold the story neatly back into private tragedy, erasing inconvenient truths. Friends and colleagues, interviewed in the weeks that followed, recalled their unease. Some described Carole as deeply troubled, yes, but not fatally resigned. Others pointed to her ongoing projects, scripts she had been reading, a charity engagement she had planned as signs she had not yet surrendered. In one haunting detail, a friend insisted Carole had scheduled a hair appointment for the following week. "You don't make appointments for next week if you're planning to die today," she said. And yet, the autopsy had the authority of science, or at least the appearance of it. Once signed, stamped, and filed, the words carried more weight than the whispers of friends. Suicide was the verdict, and Hollywood accepted it, allowing the industry to return to its rhythms without disruption. But the echoes persisted. In the years since, researchers, biographers, and amateur investigators have returned again and again to those sparse medical notes. They pore over the contradictions, the silences, the omissions. Each time, the same unease rises, the sense that the autopsy answered less than it should have. In the absence of certainty, symbolism rushes in to fill the void. The image of Carole's body on the bathroom floor, surrounded by silence, becomes more than a fact. It becomes a metaphor for the way Hollywood treated her life and her death. She was reduced to an image, stripped of depth, and filed away. The woman behind the smile, the heart behind the image, was left unexamined both in life and in death. A clock ticks in the coroner's office, marking the passage of time as papers are filed away. With each tick, another possibility fades. Another truth becomes unreachable. The official report remains, brittle with age but immovable, a monument to finality. Yet for those who look closer, the report is not an answer but a question, one that refuses to be silenced. What is left is not evidence, but atmosphere. The heavy stillness of a case closed too soon, the uneasy silence of voices not recorded. The autopsy was meant to end the story. Instead, it became another chapter in the mystery, another locked door in a house filled with unanswered echoes. In the weeks that followed, the official story hardened into permanence. Newspapers ran the same simple line: Carole Landis, the beautiful actress once adored by millions, had died by her own hand. But those who knew her intimately refused to let the story settle. Their voices, scattered yet insistent, created a counterpoint to Hollywood's polished silence. One friend recalled visiting her just days before her death. Carole, she said, had been radiant, almost hopeful. She spoke of new scripts, of wanting to reignite her career, of traveling abroad. She was tired, yes, the friend admitted, but not finished. She still wanted the world. Another, a fellow actress, remembered Carole confessing her loneliness, but punctuating it with laughter, as though refusing to let despair have the final word. These contradictions painted a more complicated portrait than the headlines allowed. A woman capable of despair, but also of resilience. Then there were the darker recollections, those who noticed a deepening shadow in her eyes, a heaviness in her voice. She had spoken of being trapped, of feeling invisible despite her fame, of giving everything and receiving little in return. One close confidant remembered her saying, "People love what I give them, not who I am." That line, heavy with truth, became a refrain among those who believed her despair was genuine, not staged. The letters she left behind only deepened the puzzle. To some, they were clear evidence of a woman preparing to leave life. To others, they read like cries for help, messages meant to be found in time. The timing, the tone, even the placement of the letters fueled endless speculation. If she had truly intended finality, why scatter so many words for so many people? And why did some letters seem to plead rather than conclude? Among her circle, the name of Rex Harrison surfaced again and again. Some insisted he was her undoing, that his coldness had pushed her past the edge. Others argued that he was only one thread in a much larger tapestry of disappointment and exhaustion. But nearly all agreed on one point. Carole had been left too alone with her despair. Whispers persisted of a different kind of silence. One friend recalled arriving at her home after her death and noticing that things felt too neat, as if someone had tidied the scene. Another claimed to have seen letters that later disappeared, their contents never revealed to the public. These memories were fragmented, unreliable perhaps, yet they carried the unsettling weight of omission. As the years passed, those who had loved her tried to keep her alive in memory. They spoke of her laughter, the way she threw her head back without restraint. They remembered her generosity with soldiers during the war, the countless hours she spent visiting hospitals, writing letters, sending photographs to men who needed reminders of beauty in a brutal world. She was not merely a starlet. They insisted she was a woman of heart, with a kindness that had been as defining as her beauty. And yet, even in their tributes, there was an unshakable note of guilt. They wondered if they had missed the signs, if they had been too dazzled by her brightness to notice the fractures beneath. One friend put it simply, "Carole was always giving. We didn't see she was running out." The psychological truth embedded in her story is one as old as tragedy itself. That despair and vitality can coexist in the same soul. That a person can make plans for tomorrow while quietly surrendering today. Carole Landis embodied that contradiction, living between laughter and sorrow, between hope and resignation. In the end, the voices of her friends remain like overlapping echoes, some insisting she wanted to live, others convinced she had chosen to die. The truth lies somewhere in the chorus, blurred, unreachable. What is certain is that Carole was more than the polished headlines, more than the obituary crafted for public consumption. She was a woman of dazzling contradictions, remembered by those who knew her not as a mystery to solve, but as a light extinguished too soon. And still, the question lingers. When the people closest to someone remember them in such different ways, can the truth ever be found, or is it forever lost between memory and silence? Carole Landis was not the first beautiful woman to meet a premature end in Hollywood, and she would not be the last. Her story slipped, almost seamlessly, into a lineage of tragedies that formed a chilling pattern starlets, whose names once burned bright on marquees, reduced to whispers in the aftermath of their deaths. In this pattern, beauty became not salvation, but a burden. Fame, not immortality, but a sentence. The roll call is grim. Thelma Todd, the ice cream blonde before Carole, found dead in her car in 1935 under circumstances that remain debated. Carbon monoxide poisoning or something more sinister? Peg Entwistle, who leapt from the Hollywood sign in 1932, immortalized forever as the Hollywood sign girl, a symbol of dreams broken at the threshold of fame. Jean Harlow, luminous and adored, dead at 26 from kidney failure after whispers of neglect and secrecy surrounded her final illness. Each death, wrapped in ambiguity, folded into Hollywood's mythology, as though the city itself demanded sacrifices from its chosen women. Carole's death fit neatly into this macabre pattern. The studios, the press, even audiences grew accustomed to the spectacle of fallen starlets. Their tragedies were softened into cautionary tales, their lives reduced to archetypes, the ingenue destroyed by excess, the lover undone by heartbreak, the beauty consumed by despair. In this way, the women were stripped of their individuality, becoming instead part of a grim chorus that sang of fame's hidden cost. Yet, there was something particularly haunting about Carole's place in this lineage. She was not just a victim of illness or despair. She seemed to embody the full paradox of Hollywood itself. She had been the smiling face of wartime glamour, the soldier's girl, whose image was painted on bombers and pinned in barracks, the fantasy of survival in a world at war. For men fighting in foreign lands, she was hope incarnate. To then discover that she herself had been unable to withstand her own private battles felt like a betrayal of that promise. Her death carried with it the symbolism of inevitability. A woman celebrated for her vitality, undone by silence. A performer adored for her laughter, remembered for despair. A starlet who embodied brightness, yet whose name is most often spoken in the same breath as darkness. This tension placed her squarely in the lineage of Hollywood's forgotten starlets, bright flames snuffed out, leaving behind only smoke and questions. Cultural critics have long pointed out that the deaths of women like Carole became part of the industry's architecture. They reinforced myths of fragile femininity, of women too delicate for the pressures of fame, even as men died in excess with their legacies celebrated as rebellious genius. For every James Dean or Kurt Cobain mythologized as tragic icons, there were dozens of women like Carole, reduced instead to morality tales about love gone wrong. It is in this context that Carole's tragedy deepens. She was not merely a victim of her own despair, if indeed despair was her undoing. She was also a casualty of a system that commodified beauty while neglecting humanity, that celebrated image while ignoring substance, that demanded constant giving without offering refuge in return. In that sense, she joins a long, unbroken line of women who were devoured by the very industry they helped to adorn. The image is almost ritualistic, a mirror reflecting a face too perfect, a clock ticking in a silent room, a letter left behind like an offering. These motifs repeat, not just in Carole's story, but in the stories of those who came before and after. Each becomes part of a dark pattern woven into Hollywood's fabric, a reminder that the city's dream machine was also a graveyard of forgotten women. In remembering Carole Landis, one cannot help but feel the pull of this lineage. Her story is unique, yes, but it is also familiar, echoing across decades. It is the story of Thelma Todd, of Peg Entwistle, of countless others whose beauty and ambition collided with forces too merciless to withstand. Together, their lives form a constellation of extinguished stars, bright, tragic, and forever unresolved. The story of Carole Landis ends not with the glamour that defined her public image, but with the contradictions that haunted her private life. She was 29 years old when the world declared her gone, and yet her life was far too layered, too unresolved, to be reduced to a single cause of death. Suicide, despair, heartbreak. These were the words chosen to close her file, but they do not close the mystery. Carole was a woman of dazzling surfaces and hidden depths. On screen, she shimmered luminous, comedic, sensual. Off screen, she carried journals filled with doubts, letters aching with longing, and a heart that seemed to love too recklessly. The world adored her face, her body, her laughter. But Carole herself longed to be adored for something quieter. Her kindness, her seriousness, her worth beyond beauty. It was this gap between who she was and who she was allowed to be that defined her contradictions and perhaps sealed her fate. Her death left behind no certainty, only echoes. Some insist she chose to leave, weary of disappointment, betrayed in love. Others argue she was silenced. Her despair deepened or manipulated by men who sought to protect themselves more than her. Still others see in her final acts not a will to die, but a desperate plea for acknowledgement that came too late. The truth may lie in all these explanations at once, tangled together like strands of a necklace dropped and shattered across a tiled floor. Hollywood, meanwhile, moved forward, indifferent. Stars rise, stars fall. The machine continues. Carole became another ghost in its archives, her name recalled occasionally in histories of forgotten actresses, her image resurfacing in old posters, her death whispered about by those who study Hollywood's underbelly. The system that once used her glow swiftly consumed her silence, and yet her presence lingers. In the letters she wrote, in the photographs soldiers carried across oceans, in the fragile memory of a woman who tried to give more of herself than she received. Her story is not only about death, but about the human cost of illusion. What happens when the person inside is devoured by the role demanded outside? The mirror in her dressing room reflected perfection, but behind it was a woman staring back at herself, wondering how much longer she could keep up the act. The philosophical question that rises from her story is this: how do we measure a life lived in contradictions? Was Carole Landis a victim of her own choices, or of a system that denied her the right to be whole? Perhaps she was both. Perhaps the truest tragedy is not only that she died so young, but that in life she was never fully seen. Not by the industry, not by the public, not even by the man she loved most. Her legacy is etched in those contradictions. A woman celebrated for her vitality, remembered for her despair. A starlet adored for her image, forgotten for her depth. A life that looked dazzling from the outside, but ended in silence on a bathroom floor. As the years pass, the mystery of Carole Landis does not fade, it sharpens. Like the ticking of a clock in an empty house, it reminds us that some stories are never closed, only suspended in time, waiting for someone to listen differently. Her death remains a question, but her life remains an echo, a reminder that beneath every bright face in Hollywood lies a soul that longs to be understood. Carole Landis, the ice cream blonde, the soldier's girl, the forgotten starlet. She is all of these, and yet she is more. She is contradiction itself, a symbol of the perilous beauty of fame. In her silence, she still speaks.